Sydney Parker sat at her desk, the city lights twinkling outside her office window. The clock on the wall showed it was well past midnight, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the stack of documents before her, the final details of the merger between her company and her husband's. It was a deal they had been working on for months, the culmination of years of hard work and dedication. As she reached for her phone to check the time, she realized she had accidentally grabbed Sawyer's instead. They had matching cases, a whimsical choice they had made together on their last anniversary. Just as she was about to set it down, a notification flashed across the screen. A message from Victoria. Sydney's hand froze midair. Victoria was Sawyer's VP, a recent hire who had quickly climbed the corporate ladder. There was something about the way the notification was worded that made Sydney's stomach clench. Against her better judgment, she opened the conversation. What she saw made her blood run cold. Flirtatious messages, late-night meeting arrangements, suggestive comments. Sydney's mind reeled as she scrolled through weeks of exchanges, each one feeling like a knife to her heart. Suddenly, memories flooded her mind. Sawyer's infectious laugh as they planned their future together on their honeymoon. The proud look in his eyes when they closed their first major deal as a married couple. The way he held her hand during board meetings, a silent show of support and unity. These cherished moments now felt tainted, overshadowed by the betrayal glaring at her from the phone screen. Sydney barely remembered the drive home, her mind a whirlwind of emotions and fragmented thoughts. As she walked through the door, she found Sawyer in the kitchen, preparing a late-night snack. The sight of him, so normal and unaware, made her anger flare. Care to explain these? Sydney's voice was low and controlled as she thrust the phone towards Sawyer, the incriminating messages on full display. Sawyer's face paled as he took in the screen. Sid, it's not what you think. I can explain. Explain what, Sawyer? How you've been sneaking around with your VP behind my back. How you made a fool of me. Sydney's voice rose with each question, her composure cracking. No, you've got it all wrong. Victoria and I were just what? Friends? Colleagues? Because these messages tell a very different story. Sydney cut him off, her words laced with venom. Sawyer reached for his laptop, frantically pulling up other conversations. Look, see? There's context you're missing. We were discussing work projects, team-building exercises. You're misinterpreting. But Sydney was beyond listening. The trust she had built with Sawyer over years felt shattered in an instant. Every explanation he offered sounded hollow, every defense seeming like another lie. Unable to bear it any longer, Sydney grabbed her keys and stormed out of the house. She drove aimlessly through the city, tears blurring her vision. Eventually, she found herself parked outside Arya's apartment building. With shaking hands, she dialed her best friend's number. Arya? I need a place to stay tonight. Arya's concerned voice came through the speaker. Sid? What's wrong? Come up, I'll buzz you in. Moments later, Sydney collapsed into Arya's arms, sobs racking her body. Through broken sentences, she explained what she had discovered. Arya listened, offering comfort and tissues in equal measure. As the night wore on, Sydney's mind tortured her with images of Sawyer and Victoria together. Every interaction she had witnessed between them at work now seemed suspect. The lingering glances, the inside jokes, the late nights at the office, all took on a sinister new meaning. Sleep eluded Sydney. She spent the night reviewing the messages over and over, analyzing every word, every timestamp. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through Arya's curtains, Sydney had made a decision. With a heavy heart, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she never thought she'd have to use. Mr. Thompson, this is Sydney Parker. I need you to prepare divorce papers immediately. The lawyer's voice was professionally neutral as he acknowledged her request, promising to have the documents ready by the afternoon. As Sydney ended the call, she felt a mix of numbness and resolve. The life she had carefully built with Sawyer was crumbling around her, but she refused to play the fool any longer. There was one more call she needed to make, one that would send shockwaves through both their companies. With red-rimmed eyes and a trembling hand, Sydney picked up her phone and dialed the number for her company's board of directors, ready to cancel the merger she had worked so hard to achieve. Sydney's trembling finger hovered over the send button on her phone. With a deep breath, she pressed it, officially canceling the merger that had been months in the making. The weight of her decision crashed down upon her, but the pain of betrayal fueled her resolve. Within minutes, her phone exploded with notifications. Executives from both companies were in an uproar, demanding explanations and emergency meetings. Sydney silenced her phone, unable to deal with the chaos she had just unleashed. Meanwhile, across town, Sawyer stared at his phone in disbelief. He had woken up to find Sydney gone, and now this. He dialed her number for the 100th time, only to be met with her voicemail once again. "Sydney, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "We need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding. I love you. Call me back." At Sawyer's office, Victoria's lips curled into a subtle smile as she overheard the commotion about the canceled merger. Her plan was unfolding perfectly, though she maintained a facade of concern for her colleagues. Back at Sydney's company, the atmosphere was tense. She sat at the head of the conference table, her team's eyes boring into her, demanding answers she wasn't prepared to give. "I understand this is sudden," Sydney began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But circumstances have changed, and the merger is no longer in our best interest." She avoided eye contact, knowing her explanation was vague at best. From the corner of her eye, Sydney noticed Arya watching her with concern. Her best friend could always read her like a book, and right now, Sydney knew she looked as terrible as she felt. As the meeting adjourned, Sydney retreated to her office, hoping for a moment of peace. But it was short-lived. The door burst open, and there stood Sawyer, his eyes wild with desperation. "Sydney, please, just give me 5 minutes," he begged, moving towards her desk. Sydney's heart raced, a mix of love and hurt battling within her. "Sawyer, you need to leave," she managed to say, her voice stronger than she felt. "Not until you hear me out. Victoria is dash." Before he could finish, security guards appeared, gently but firmly escorting him out. "I'm being set up," Sawyer yelled as the elevator doors closed on him. The commotion left Sydney feeling drained. A wave of nausea hit her suddenly, and she gripped her desk for support. "It's just the stress," she told herself, taking deep breaths to calm her churning stomach. As the day wore on, Sydney found herself staring at the divorce papers her lawyer had sent over. Her pen hovered above the signature line, memories of happier times with Sawyer flashing through her mind. Their first date, their wedding day, late nights planning their future together. It all seemed like a distant dream now. A knock on her office door snapped her out of her reverie. It was Victoria, her face a mask of concern. "Sydney, I heard about the merger. I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" Sydney's eyes narrowed. Was that a glimmer of satisfaction she saw in Victoria's eyes? Before she could respond, another wave of dizziness washed over her. The room began to spin, and Sydney felt herself falling. "Sydney!" Arya's voice seemed far away as darkness engulfed her. The next thing Sydney knew, she was lying on a hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors filling the room. Arya sat beside her, worry etched on her face. "What happened?" Sydney croaked, her throat dry. "You fainted at the office," Arya explained, squeezing her hand. "The doctor ran some tests. He should be back soon with the results." As if on cue, the door opened, and the doctor walked in, his expression serious as he clutched a clipboard. "Mrs. Parker, we need to talk," the doctor said, his tone grave. "You're pregnant." Sydney's world tilted on its axis. Pregnant? How could this be happening now, of all times? As the implications of this news washed over her, she felt a mix of joy, fear, and utter confusion. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, a life-changing revelation that would force her to reconsider everything. "Mrs. Parker, we need to talk. You're pregnant." Sydney sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her mind struggling to process the doctor's words. Pregnant. The word echoed in her head, a stark contrast to the turmoil of the past few days. Arya, her best friend, stood beside her, a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sid, are you okay?" Arya asked, her voice laced with concern. Sydney shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know, Arya. How can I be okay? Everything's falling apart. And now this. Arya pulled her into a tight embrace. You're not alone in this, Sydney. I'm here for you, no matter what you decide. As Sydney left the hospital, her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Should she tell Sawyer? Did he even deserve to know? The weight of the decision pressed down on her as she drove home, her hand unconsciously resting on her still flat stomach. Back at her apartment, Sydney paced back and forth, her phone in hand. After what felt like hours, she finally dialed Sawyer's number, her heart pounding with each ring. Sydney, Sawyer's voice was a mixture of surprise and hope. We need to talk, Sydney said, her voice trembling. Can you meet me at the cafe on 5th in an hour? The cafe was quiet when Sydney arrived. She chose a secluded corner booth, her hands wrapped around a mug of herbal tea. When Sawyer walked in, their eyes met, and for a moment, Sydney felt a pang of the love they once shared. Sawyer sat down, his face etched with worry. Sydney, I'm so glad you called. I've been trying to explain Dash. I'm pregnant, Sydney blurted out, cutting him off. Sawyer's eyes widened, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, he managed to speak. Pregnant? Are you sure? Sydney nodded, unable to meet his gaze. I found out today. I thought you should know. Sydney, I don't know what to say, but I want you to know that I'm here. For you and the baby. I know you don't trust me right now, but I swear I'll do whatever it takes to prove my innocence and be there for our child. As Sawyer spoke, Sydney felt a mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to believe him, to fall into his arms and forget everything that had happened. But the wounds were still too fresh, the doubt too strong. I appreciate that, Sawyer, she said, her voice carefully controlled. But right now, I need time to process this. We can discuss arrangements later. As they parted ways outside the cafe, Sydney couldn't help but notice the pain in Sawyer's eyes. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had misjudged him. The next few days passed in a blur of doctor's appointments and sleepless nights. Sydney found herself standing in front of the mirror, studying her reflection for any signs of the life growing inside her. It was during one of these moments that her phone buzzed with a message from Sawyer. First prenatal appointment tomorrow at 10. Can I be there? Sydney hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. After a long moment, she replied with a simple okay. The waiting room of the obstetrician's office was tense. Sydney sat rigidly in her chair, acutely aware of Sawyer's presence beside her. When the nurse called her name, they both stood, an awkward dance of uncertainty. Inside the examination room, the doctor's soothing voice filled the air as she explained the procedure. But it was the sound of the baby's heartbeat that truly captivated them. Strong and steady, it echoed through the room, momentarily washing away all the hurt and confusion. Sydney looked at Sawyer, surprised to see tears in his eyes. For a brief moment, their hands found each other, fingers intertwining as they shared this miraculous sound. As they left the doctor's office, the awkwardness returned. Thank you for letting me be there, Sawyer said softly. Sydney nodded, her emotions a tangled mess. We should talk about how we're going to handle this. But not today. I need some time. Sawyer agreed, his eyes never leaving her face. Take all the time you need, Sydney. I'll be here when you're ready. That night, as Sydney lay in bed, her hand resting on her stomach, she found herself thinking of Sawyer. Despite everything, a small part of her longed for the comfort of his arms, the security of their life together. But trust, once broken, was not easily mended. Across town, in her sleek apartment, Victoria stood by the window, a glass of wine in hand. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Sawyer's car pull into the parking lot of his building. A smirk played on her lips as she raised the glass in a mock toast. "Oh, Sawyer," she murmured, "you have no idea what's coming." Meanwhile, in her own apartment, Arya sat hunched over her laptop, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had been digging into Victoria's past for hours, following a hunch that something wasn't quite right. As she clicked through old news articles and corporate records, her eyes suddenly widened in shock. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Sydney needs to see this. Arya's eyes widened as she uncovered a shocking revelation about Victoria's past on her computer screen late into the night. Sydney's mind raced as she tried to process the information Arya had just shared with her. Victoria's past was far from spotless, and the pattern of behavior Arya had uncovered was unsettling, to say the least. "Are you sure about this, Arya?" Sydney asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arya nodded solemnly. "I've double-checked everything. Victoria has a history of, let's call it strategic relationship manipulation in her previous companies, always climbing the corporate ladder through less than ethical means." Sydney leaned back in her chair, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. She found herself mentally revisiting every interaction she'd had with Victoria, searching for clues she might have missed. As if on cue, Sydney's phone buzzed with a notification. A major deal her company had been working on for months had fallen through inexplicably. She frowned, scrolling through the details. Something didn't add up. "This doesn't make sense," Sydney muttered. "We had everything in place. How could it have gone sideways so quickly?" Arya peered over her shoulder, her brow furrowing. "You don't think?" Sydney's eyes widened as realization dawned. Victoria. She must have had access to inside information through Sawyer's company. But why would she sabotage this? Before they could delve deeper into their suspicions, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. To Sydney's surprise, it was Sawyer, looking concerned and carrying a bag. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said hesitantly. I brought you some prenatal vitamins and some healthy snacks. The doctor mentioned it was important for your diet, and I thought." Sydney felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Anger, confusion, and a touch of warmth she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. "Thank you, Sawyer. That's thoughtful of you." As Sawyer set the bag down, their eyes met, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to dissipate. Sydney found herself remembering why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. His genuine care and attention to detail. The moment was shattered by Sydney's phone ringing. It was her CFO, panic evident in his voice as he detailed the financial implications of the failed deal. Sydney's stress level skyrocketed, and she felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. Sawyer, noticing her distress, stepped closer. "Sydney, is everything okay? You look pale." She waved him off, trying to focus on the call, but her mind was spinning. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? As Sydney ended the call, she became aware of Sawyer and Arya exchanging worried glances. She took a deep breath, trying to center herself. "I need to get back to the office," Sydney announced, standing up perhaps a bit too quickly. She swayed slightly, and Sawyer instinctively reached out to steady her. "You need to rest," he insisted. "Whatever it is, it can wait." Sydney shook her head. "No, it can't. My company is in trouble, and I need to fix it." As she gathered her things, Arya pulled her aside. "Be careful, Sid. We don't know what Victoria is capable of. Don't push yourself too hard." Sydney nodded, her mind already racing with potential solutions to her company's sudden crisis. As she left, she couldn't help but notice Sawyer's lingering gaze, filled with concern and something else she couldn't quite identify. Back at her office, Sydney dove into damage control mode. As she worked tirelessly to mitigate the fallout from the failed deal, rumors began to circulate about the stability of her company. Each whisper felt like a personal attack, and Sydney found herself questioning every decision she'd made in the past few months. Meanwhile, across town, Sawyer was beginning to notice oddities in Victoria's behavior at work. Small inconsistencies in reports, meetings that didn't quite add up, and an overall sense that something was off. As he reviewed some documents late one night, a discrepancy caught his eye. He frowned, digging deeper into the numbers. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself, unaware that he was echoing Sydney's earlier sentiments. Just then, Victoria walked into his office, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Working late again, Sawyer? You should really take some time for yourself, you know." Sawyer looked up, his suspicion carefully masked. "Just tying up some loose ends. How about you? Heading out?" Victoria nodded, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. "Yes, big day tomorrow. We should both get some rest." As she left, Sawyer couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Victoria than met the eye. He made a mental note to look into those discrepancies further. The next day, Sydney found herself face to face with Victoria at an industry event. The tension between them was palpable, their conversation a dance of veiled threats and double meanings. "I hear your company's been having some difficulties," Victoria said, her tone deceptively sympathetic. "Such a shame, especially with the baby on the way. Stress isn't good for expectant mothers, you know." Sydney's eyes narrowed. "My company is fine, Victoria, and I appreciate your concern, but I can handle my personal life just fine." As they parted ways, Sydney couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine. She needed to talk to Sawyer, to warn him about their suspicions regarding Victoria. Later that evening, Sydney and Sawyer met in a neutral location to discuss the future of their unborn child. The conversation was stilted, the air between them thick with unresolved emotions and unsaid words. "Sawyer," Sydney began hesitantly, "there's something I need to tell you about Victoria." Before she could continue, they were interrupted by a waiter. As Sydney watched Sawyer interact politely with the staff, she was struck by how much she missed the easy companionship they once shared. Unbeknownst to them, Victoria observed their meeting from afar, her mind already formulating her next move. She smiled to herself, confident that her carefully laid plans would soon come to fruition. As Sydney prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello," she said cautiously. A distorted voice came through the speaker. "I have information that can prove Sawyer's innocence. Meet me in 1 hour at the empty parking lot on Oak Street." Sydney's heart pounded as she stared at her phone, the anonymous message still glowing on the screen. The promise of information that could prove Sawyer's innocence was tempting, but the risk was undeniable. She paced her living room, debating whether to go to the meeting. After what felt like hours of internal struggle, she made her decision. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. The night air was crisp as Sydney pulled into the empty parking lot on Oak Street. Her headlights illuminated nothing but abandoned spaces and shadows. She killed the engine, plunging herself into darkness. With trembling hands, she checked her phone. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes to go. As the clock struck midnight, a figure emerged from behind a concrete pillar. Sydney's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the silhouette of a man. He approached her car slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. Sydney rolled down her window just enough to hear him speak. "Mrs. Parker?" The man's voice was low and gravelly. "I used to work with Victoria at Zenith Corporation. What she's doing to you and Mr. Parker, it's not the first time." Sydney listened intently as the man, who introduced himself as Derek, recounted Victoria's history of manipulating colleagues and sabotaging relationships to climb the corporate ladder. Each word he spoke felt like a dagger to Sydney's heart, realizing how thoroughly she had been deceived. Meanwhile, across town, Sawyer was burning the midnight oil at his office. Frustrated by his inability to prove his innocence, he decided to dig deeper into the company's records. As he sifted through countless emails and documents, something caught his eye. A series of emails between Victoria and an unknown account, filled with coded language and veiled threats. Sawyer's hands shook as he realized he had stumbled upon the evidence he desperately needed. Back in the parking lot, Sydney thanked Derek for his information, her mind reeling from the revelations. As she drove home, a mix of emotions washed over her. Relief that Sawyer might be innocent, guilt for not believing him, and anger at Victoria's betrayal. She reached for her phone, scrolling to Sawyer's number, her finger hovering over the call button. But something held her back. She needed time to process everything. The next morning, Sawyer arrived at the office early, determined to confront Victoria with the evidence he had found. He found her in the break room, casually sipping coffee as if she hadn't turned their lives upside down. "Victoria, we need to talk," Sawyer said, his voice steely. Victoria's eyes narrowed, sensing the change in Sawyer's demeanor. "What about, Sawyer? Is something wrong?" Sawyer laid out the emails he had discovered, watching as Victoria's composed facade began to crack. "Want to explain these?" Victoria's denial was cold and practiced. "I don't know what you're talking about, Sawyer. Those emails could mean anything. You're just desperate to save your marriage." Their confrontation was interrupted by Sawyer's phone ringing. It was Arya, her voice frantic. Sawyer, it's Sydney. She collapsed at the office. We're on our way to the hospital now. Sawyer's world tilted on its axis. He rushed out of the office, leaving a fuming Victoria behind. As he sped to the hospital, his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Had the stress finally taken its toll on Sydney and the baby? At the hospital, Sawyer found Arya pacing in the waiting room. "What happened?" he demanded. Arya shook her head, worry etched on her face. "She just fainted during a meeting. The doctors are with her now." The minutes ticked by like hours as they waited for news. Finally, a doctor approached them, his expression serious. "Mr. Parker, we need to talk about your wife's condition." Sawyer braced himself for the worst, but nothing could have prepared him for the doctor's next words. "Mrs. Parker is experiencing complications due to stress. She needs absolute bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. Any more stress could be dangerous for both her and the baby." The gravity of the situation hit Sawyer like a ton of bricks. He had to fix this, not just for his marriage, but for the health of Sydney and their unborn child. He turned to Arya, determination in his eyes. "I need your help. We have to expose Victoria and clear my name. It's the only way to give Sydney the peace she needs." Arya nodded, ready to do whatever it took to help her friend. As they began to formulate a plan, neither of them noticed Victoria lurking in the shadows of the hospital corridor, her eyes cold and calculating. In her hospital room, Sydney lay awake, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. She reached for her phone, ready to call Sawyer and tell him everything she had learned. But before she could dial, a new message popped up on her screen. The number was unknown, but the threat was clear. "Stay away from Sawyer, or all the companies will suffer. You have 24 hours to decide." Sydney's heart raced as she stared at the threatening message on her phone. The hospital room suddenly felt suffocating. She looked up at Sawyer and Arya, their faces etched with concern. "We need to act fast," Sawyer said, his voice low and determined. "Victoria's gone too far this time." Arya nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. "I'll trace the origin of this message. We'll find out where it came from and who sent it." As Arya left the room, Sydney struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain. "I can't just lie here while Victoria threatens everything we've built." Sawyer gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Sydney, please. The doctor said you need rest. Think about the baby." For a moment, Sydney felt a flicker of the old connection between them. She looked into Sawyer's eyes, seeing genuine concern and love. Despite everything that had happened, she knew he cared deeply for her and their unborn child. "I can't rest knowing Victoria is out there plotting against us," Sydney insisted. "We need to face her together." Reluctantly, Sawyer agreed. As they left the hospital against medical advice, Sydney felt a mix of determination and fear. They headed straight to Sawyer's office, where they began combing through files and emails, searching for any evidence that could expose Victoria's schemes. As they worked side by side for the first time since their separation, Sydney couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity and comfort. Sawyer's presence, once a source of pain, now felt reassuring. Suddenly, Sawyer's phone buzzed. His face paled as he read the message. "Victoria is threatening to leak sensitive corporate information to the press. We need to secure the documents now." They rushed to Sawyer's office, hearts pounding. As the elevator doors opened, they came face to face with Victoria. The air crackled with tension as the three stood in silence, each calculating their next move. Victoria's lips curled into a smirk. "Well, isn't this cozy?" The happy couple reunited. Sydney stepped forward, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "It's over, Victoria. We know what you've done." Before Victoria could respond, Sawyer's phone rang. It was Arya. "I've found something big about Victoria's past. You won't believe what she's been hiding." As Sawyer listened intently, Sydney felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She leaned against the wall, trying to steady herself. Sawyer noticed immediately, ending the call and rushing to her side. "Sydney, are you all right?" His voice was filled with concern. Victoria watched the scene unfold, her smirk fading as she realized her carefully laid plans were unraveling. Pushing through the discomfort, Sydney straightened up. "I'm fine. We need to find that pen drive you mentioned earlier, Sawyer." It might have the evidence we need. They hurried into Sawyer's office, leaving a fuming Victoria behind. As they searched frantically, Sydney couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Finally, Sawyer let out a triumphant cry. "I found it!" He held up a small black pen drive, his eyes shining with hope. Just as they were about to examine its contents, they heard a commotion outside. Victoria was making a run for it. Without hesitation, Sawyer grabbed Sydney's hand, and they raced after Victoria. They burst out of the building just in time to see her speeding away in her car. Sawyer didn't miss a beat. He led Sydney to his car, and they set off in hot pursuit. As they weaved through the city streets, Sydney navigated, her eyes fixed on Victoria's car ahead. The chase was intense, with Victoria taking sharp turns and risky maneuvers to shake them off. Sydney's heart pounded, not just from the excitement, but from a growing discomfort in her abdomen. Suddenly, a sharp pain struck her. Sydney gasped, clutching her stomach. "Sawyer," she said, her voice tight with fear, I think I'm having contractions." Sawyer's face paled. He glanced between Sydney and the road ahead, where Victoria's car was getting farther away. The internal struggle was visible on his face. Catch Victoria or ensure Sydney's safety. Another contraction hit, stronger this time. Sydney cried out in pain. "The baby's coming, Sawyer. Now!" Without hesitation, Sawyer made a sharp turn, heading towards the hospital. Victoria's car disappeared from view, but Sawyer's focus was entirely on Sydney now. As Sawyer sped through the streets, Sydney gritted her teeth against the pain. She couldn't believe this was happening now, in the middle of everything. But as another contraction washed over her, she realized that nothing else mattered at this moment except for their baby. Sawyer reached over and grabbed her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "Hold on, Sydney. We're almost there. Everything's going to be okay." As they neared the hospital, Sydney turned to Sawyer, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. "Sawyer, the baby is coming right now." The hospital emergency room doors burst open as Sawyer rushed in, carrying Sydney in his arms. Her face was contorted in pain, sweat beading on her forehead as she clung to her swollen belly. "Help! She's in labor!" Sawyer shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Nurses and doctors swarmed around them immediately, whisking Sydney away on a gurney. Sawyer tried to follow, but a nurse gently held him back. "Sir, we need to prepare her for emergency delivery. Please wait here, and we'll update you as soon as possible." Sawyer paced the waiting room, his heart pounding. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed Arya's number. "Arya, it's happening. We're at the hospital. Sydney's in premature labor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm on my way," Arya replied, the sound of keys jingling in the background. Inside the delivery room, Sydney gritted her teeth against another contraction. The medical team worked swiftly, their voices calm but urgent. "Mrs. Parker, we need you to push now," the doctor instructed. Sydney summoned all her strength, the fear for her baby overriding everything else. With a final, powerful push, a tiny cry filled the room. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, quickly handing the baby to the waiting neonatal team. Sawyer's head snapped up at the sound of a baby's cry echoing from beyond the doors. A nurse emerged, her expression a mix of concern and reassurance. "Mr. Parker, your daughter has been born. She's small but fighting. We're moving her to the NICU now." Sawyer felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Joy, fear, love, and worry all tangled together. He followed the nurse to the NICU, his eyes fixed on the tiny form in the incubator. Luna was so small, her skin almost translucent. Tubes and wires seemed to engulf her fragile body. Sawyer pressed his hand against the glass, tears streaming down his face. "Hey there, little fighter," he whispered. "Daddy's here." Hours passed before Sydney regained consciousness. The doctor gently explained Luna's condition, emphasizing that while delicate, she was showing positive signs. Sawyer helped Sydney into a wheelchair and brought her to the NICU. They stood together, watching their daughter, all their recent troubles momentarily forgotten. "She's beautiful," Sydney murmured, reaching out to touch the incubator. Sawyer nodded, his arm protectively around Sydney's shoulders. "Just like her mother." Their moment of peace was interrupted by Arya bursting into the room, slightly out of breath. "I have news about Victoria," she said, her eyes darting between Sydney, Sawyer, and baby Luna. Sawyer felt torn. He wanted nothing more than to stay with his family, but he knew they wouldn't be truly safe until Victoria was stopped. Sydney seemed to read his mind. "Go," she said softly. "Find her. End this. We'll be here when you get back." Sawyer hesitated, looking between Sydney and Luna. "Are you sure?" Sydney nodded, her eyes filled with a new determination. "I can handle this. Go get her, for all of us." With a heavy heart, Sawyer kissed Sydney's forehead and whispered a promise to Luna. He turned to leave with Arya, who quickly briefed him on Victoria's suspected whereabouts. "She's trying to flee. Our sources say she's headed to a private airfield just outside the city," Arya explained as they rushed to Sawyer's car. They sped through the city streets, Sawyer's knuckles white on the steering wheel. As they approached the airfield, they could see a small jet preparing for takeoff. "That has to be her," Sawyer growled, pushing the accelerator to the floor. They screeched to a halt near the runway, just as Victoria was about to board the plane. Sawyer leapt out of the car, sprinting towards her. "Victoria," he shouted. "It's over." Victoria turned, her face a mask of cold fury. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Sawyer's phone rang. It was Arya, her voice frantic. "Come back now. Something's wrong with Luna." Sawyer's world tilted on its axis. He looked at Victoria, then back at his car, his heart torn between justice and his newborn daughter. "This isn't over," he growled at Victoria before turning and sprinting back to his car. As he peeled out of the airfield, leaving a confused Victoria behind, Sawyer's mind raced with terrifying possibilities. He pressed the accelerator harder, praying he wouldn't be too late. While Sawyer confronts Victoria at the airport, he receives an urgent call from Arya. "Come back now. Something's wrong with Luna." Sawyer's heart pounded in his chest as he raced back to the hospital, his mind conjuring up worst-case scenarios. The tires of his car screeched as he pulled into the hospital parking lot, barely taking the time to shut off the engine before sprinting towards the entrance. His feet carried him swiftly through the corridors, dodging nurses and visitors alike. As he burst into the NICU, he was met with a scene that was far from what he had imagined. Luna lay peacefully in her incubator, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Sydney sat beside her, a look of confusion etched across her face. "What's going on?" Sawyer panted, his eyes darting between Sydney and their daughter. Arya called. She said something was wrong with Luna. Sydney shook her head, her brow furrowed. "Nothing's wrong. Luna's been stable all evening. I don't understand." At that moment, Arya rushed into the room, her face a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I'm so sorry, Sawyer. I received an anonymous call about Luna's condition. I think it was Victoria." Realization dawned on Sawyer's face. He had fallen for Victoria's trap, hook, line, and sinker. "She wanted me away from the airport," he muttered, pulling out his phone to contact the police station there. As Sawyer frantically explained the situation to the authorities, scenes of Victoria attempting a hasty takeoff played out at the private airstrip. The sleek jet's engines roared to life, but before it could gather speed, police vehicles swarmed the runway, their sirens wailing in the night. Back at the hospital, Sydney received the news of Victoria's capture with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "It's over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sawyer nodded, moving closer to Sydney and Luna. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were truly free from Victoria's looming threat. The weight that had been pressing down on both of them for so long began to lift. In a moment of vulnerability, Sydney looked up at Sawyer, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She gently picked up Luna, cradling her close before turning to Sawyer. "Would you like to hold her?" Sawyer's breath caught in his throat. This simple gesture spoke volumes about the trust Sydney was placing in him once again. With trembling hands, he took Luna into his arms, marveling at how such a tiny being could hold so much of his heart. As they stood there, a family reunited, Arya slipped out of the room to give them privacy. She headed straight for the police station, armed with the final pieces of evidence that would nail Victoria's coffin shut. At the station, Victoria sat in an interrogation room, her usually impeccable appearance now disheveled. Under the relentless questioning and faced with mounting evidence, her icy facade began to crack. Finally, in a moment of defeat, she confessed to her elaborate scheme of manipulation and corporate sabotage. Arya arrived just as Victoria was being led away in handcuffs. She handed over the last damning pieces of evidence to the detective in charge, ensuring that Victoria would face the full extent of the law. Back in the hospital room, Sydney and Sawyer found themselves truly alone together for the first time in months. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words and lingering doubts. "I'm sorry," Sawyer began, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have seen through her lies. I should have fought harder to make you believe me." Sydney shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I'm sorry. I should have trusted you, should have given you a chance to explain. I let my fears and insecurities cloud my judgment." As they talked, really talked, for the first time since the nightmare began, they began to see a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, but they both realized that what they had was worth fighting for. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A doctor entered, a smile on his face. "I have good news," he announced. "Luna has shown remarkable progress. We believe she's strong enough to leave the NICU and move to a regular room." The news washed over Sydney and Sawyer like a wave of hope. Together, they followed the doctor as he led them to a new room, pushing Luna's crib between them. As they settled Luna into her new surroundings, Sawyer couldn't help but feel that this moment symbolized a new beginning for all of them. The worst was behind them, and though challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Sydney stood by the window, gazing out at the city lights. Sawyer joined her, tentatively placing an arm around her shoulders. To his relief, she leaned into him, accepting the comfort he offered. They stood there in companionable silence, watching over their sleeping daughter. The future, which had seemed so bleak just days ago, now held the promise of redemption and renewed love. Sydney turned to Sawyer, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and trepidation. "We need to talk about our future," she said softly. "All three of us." Sydney sat in the hospital room, her eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in her arms. Luna's peaceful breathing was a stark contrast to the tumultuous events of the past few months. Sawyer stood by the window, his gaze alternating between his newborn daughter and his estranged wife. The air was thick with unspoken words and lingering doubts. "Sawyer," Sydney began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk about what happened, about us." He turned, his eyes meeting hers. "I know. I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time." As they began to open up, the walls they had built around themselves slowly started to crumble. Sydney expressed her fear and betrayal, while Sawyer laid bare his frustration and hurt at not being believed. It was a raw, honest conversation that left them both emotionally drained, but somehow lighter. The next day, they took Luna home for the first time. As they crossed the threshold, Sydney couldn't help but remember the last time she had left this house. Hurt, angry, and believing her marriage was over. Now, she was returning with a new life in her arms and a cautious hope in her heart. That night was a baptism by fire into parenthood. Luna's cries pierced the darkness every few hours, and Sydney and Sawyer took turns comforting her. In those quiet moments, rocking their daughter back to sleep, they found a new kind of intimacy, one built on shared responsibility and mutual support. The real test came when they had to face the corporate world. The boardroom was tense as they met with the counsels of both companies to discuss the damage caused by Victoria's actions. Sydney felt the weight of every decision, hyper-aware of Sawyer's presence beside her. When it came time to make a crucial choice about salvaging a major contract, she hesitated, old doubts creeping in. Sawyer noticed her hesitation and made a bold move. He announced he would step back from a lucrative deal that would have benefited his company greatly, instead proposing a solution that prioritized the stability of both their businesses, and by extension, their family. Sydney was stunned by his sacrifice, recognizing it as the gesture of trust and commitment it was. The media circus that followed was intense. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions as Sydney and Sawyer emerged from their offices, presenting a united front. Behind closed doors, they were still navigating the delicate balance of rebuilding trust. But to the world, they stood together, hands clasped tightly. One evening, Sydney found Sawyer in the nursery, gently rocking Luna to sleep. He motioned for her to rest, insisting he had everything under control. As she lay in bed, Sydney's eyes fell on an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, she was transported back to the early days of their relationship. The laughter, the stolen glances, the dreams they had shared. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to remember why she had fallen in love with Sawyer in the first place. Working side by side to reorganize their companies brought back a familiar rhythm. They found themselves finishing each other's sentences in meetings, their business acumen complementing each other perfectly. It was during one of these late-night strategy sessions that an argument flared up about trust. "How can I be sure you won't doubt me again?" Sawyer asked, his voice strained. Sydney's reply was equally heated. "How can I be sure there won't be another Victoria?" The silence that followed was deafening. Then almost simultaneously, they both started to laugh. The absurdity of their situation, the progress they had made, and the lingering fears all came crashing down in that moment of shared mirth. Arya, ever the supportive friend, organized a small dinner to celebrate Luna's recovery and the couple's gradual reconciliation. As they sat surrounded by their closest friends, Sydney felt a warmth she had missed for so long. She caught Sawyer's eye across the table, and the smile they shared was one of understanding and renewed connection. The true test of their rekindled partnership came when they had to present a joint plan to save both their companies. Standing before the board, Sydney felt Sawyer's presence beside her like a steady anchor. Their presentation was flawless, showcasing not just their business acumen, but their ability to work together seamlessly. When the board voted unanimously to approve the revival of the merger, Sydney felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just a business victory, it was a testament to their resilience as a couple. Later that night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Sydney finally allowed herself to lower all her guards. She turned to Sawyer, tears glistening in her eyes, and embraced him fully. No words were needed. The gesture spoke volumes about forgiveness, trust, and hope for the future. As they held each other, the city lights twinkling below them like stars, Sawyer pulled away slightly. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Sydney's breath caught in her throat as he slowly knelt down on one knee. "Sydney," Sawyer began, his voice thick with emotion, "I know we've been through hell and back, but there's no one else I'd rather face life's challenges with. You're my partner in every sense of the word. Would you do me the honor of marrying me again?" The warm spring sun filtered through the windows of the bridal suite, casting a golden glow on Sydney as she stood before the full-length mirror. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her simple, yet elegant white dress. The past year had been a whirlwind of emotions, challenges, and ultimately triumph. As she gazed at her reflection, Sydney couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. In the adjacent room, Sawyer nervously fiddled with his tie, Luna nestled securely in his arms. The little girl, now a year old, giggled as she reached for her father's face. Sawyer's heart swelled with love and gratitude. He never imagined he'd get a second chance at happiness, let alone with the two most important people in his life. The intimate ceremony was held in the lush gardens of their newly purchased home. Close friends and family gathered, their faces beaming with joy and support. As Sydney made her way down the aisle, her eyes locked with Sawyer's. In that moment, all the pain and mistrust of the past melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of love and hope. Arya, standing proudly as the maid of honor, stepped forward to deliver her speech. Her voice cracked with emotion as she recounted the trials and tribulations the couple had faced. "I've watched my best friend go through hell and back," Arya said, her eyes glistening. "But through it all, the love between Sydney and Sawyer proved unbreakable. They've shown us all what true partnership looks like, both in life and in business." When it came time for the vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Sydney spoke first, her voice steady and full of conviction. Sawyer, I promise to trust in our love, to communicate openly, and to face every challenge by your side. You've shown me the true meaning of forgiveness and perseverance. I love you more today than ever before. Sawyer's voice trembled as he responded, Sydney, you and Luna are my world. I vow to cherish and protect our family, to be worthy of your trust, and to love you unconditionally for all the days of our lives. As they sealed their renewed commitment with a kiss, cheers erupted from the gathered guests. The celebration seamlessly transitioned into Luna's first birthday party, the decorations a perfect blend of wedding elegance and childlike wonder. Balloons and flowers adorned every surface, each carefully chosen to represent new beginnings and hope. In a quiet moment amidst the festivities, Sydney and Sawyer found themselves on the dance floor, swaying gently to the music. As they moved, memories of their journey flashed through their minds. Their first meeting, the pain of separation, the joy of reconciliation. Each step was a reminder of how far they'd come. Luna, the tiny miracle that had brought them back together, was the star of the show. Guests cooed and fawned over her, marveling at her bright eyes and infectious laugh. Sydney and Sawyer watched with pride as their daughter charmed everyone around her. During a lull in the celebration, the couple pulled Arya aside. We can't thank you enough, Sydney said, embracing her friend tightly. Without you, we might have lost everything. Sawyer nodded in agreement. You're more than a friend, Arya. You're family. As the evening progressed, Sydney and Sawyer gathered everyone for a toast. Raising their glasses, Sawyer spoke, his voice carrying across the garden. To new beginnings in love, in family, and in business. May our merged companies be as strong and resilient as our relationship. The clinking of glasses was accompanied by hearty cheers and well wishes. As the crowd dispersed, Sydney and Sawyer found a quiet moment to talk about their future. I never thought I could be this happy again, Sydney confessed, leaning into Sawyer's embrace. We've been given a second chance, Sawyer replied, kissing her forehead, and I intend to make the most of every moment. Their conversation was interrupted by a collective gasp from the guests. Turning, they saw Luna, who had been sitting on a blanket nearby, shakily pulling herself to her feet. With determined focus, the little girl took one wobbly step, then another. Time seemed to stand still as Luna toddled across the grass, her arms outstretched. Sawyer knelt down, encouraging her with open arms. Come on, sweetheart. You can do it. Sydney watched, her heart bursting with joy, as Luna made her way from Sawyer towards her. Those few steps represented so much more than just a milestone in their daughter's life. They were a bridge, connecting their past struggles to their bright future. As Luna reached Sydney, collapsing into her mother's arms with a triumphant giggle, the gathered friends and family erupted in applause. Sydney scooped up her daughter, pressing a kiss to her chubby cheek before looking at Sawyer with tears of happiness in her eyes. In that perfect moment, surrounded by love and new possibilities, Sydney felt a surge of hope for the future. She gazed at Sawyer, her partner in every sense of the word, and smiled. I think I'm ready for us to take another big step together, she said softly. How about a little brother or sister for Luna?